Shin Seung-Woo was known simply as the Iron Dragon, a man who had ruled Seoul's underworld for 15 years without ever raising his voice. He had buried his emotions deep beneath a tailored tuxedo and a heart of ice, convinced that absolute control was the only way to survive a life built on blood. His private penthouse was a fortress, protected by the world's most advanced biometric security, a sanctuary where no one entered without his explicit permission. But on a rainy Tuesday night, the heavy silence of his inner sanctum was broken not by an alarm, but by the soft, impossible sound of laughter. Seung-Woo spun around, his hand already gripping the cold steel of his suppressor-equipped pistol, his mind calculating the trajectory for a kill shot. He was prepared for an assassin, a traitor, or a ghost from his violent past. Instead, the weapon in his hand faltered. Sitting on the imported marble floor was a toddler in a simple gray outfit, staring up at him with wide, trusting eyes. The boy didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply crawled toward the most feared man in Korea and reached out, as if he had been waiting for him all his life. Before we continuing this thrilling story, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. Where are you watching from? Like, comment, and share. The heavy oak doors, usually sealed tight against the world, creaked open with a sudden, desperate force. A woman burst into the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her uniform, a simple gray maid's dress, stained with the sweat of a frantic search. It was Ethelyn. She froze the moment she crossed the threshold, her eyes locking onto the scene that would have stopped the heart of any mother in Seoul. There was Shin Seung-Woo, the man whose whisper could dismantle corporations, towering over her son. And there was Merrick, oblivious to the danger, tugging at the hem of the dragon's tuxedo trousers with sticky, playful fingers. For a heartbeat, the room was suffocatingly silent. Seung-Woo watched the woman, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes shifting from the child to the intruder. He expected her to collapse. In his 15 years ruling the syndicate, that was the protocol of fear. People fell to their knees, they wept, they begged for mercy before he even decided their fate. But Ethelyn did not kneel. Her legs trembled, shaking so violently that the fabric of her skirt rippled, yet she remained standing. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms, anchoring her to the floor. "Merrick," she breathed, the name tearing from her throat. She didn't look at Seung-Woo's weapon, nor did she acknowledge the terrified security guards now crowding the hallway behind her, waiting for the order to drag her away. She walked forward. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like walking through fire. She reached down and scooped the toddler into her arms, pulling him against her chest as if her fragile body could shield him from the weight of the underworld. "You know who I am," Seung-Woo said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a question. "I know you are the master of this house," Ethelyn replied, her voice shaking but clear. She lifted her chin, meeting the dragon's gaze with a defiance that stunned him. "And I know my son made a mistake. He is a child. He saw an open door and he crawled through it. He breached security that cost millions to install," Seung-Woo countered, stepping closer. The scent of expensive cologne and cold steel drifted off him. "And you, the maid who cleans the lower quarters, dared to follow him into my sanctuary. Do you know the penalty for entering this room uninvited?" Ethelyn swallowed hard, her dark eyes glistening with unshed tears, but she did not look away. "I am a mother," she said, the words heavy with a quiet, unshakable dignity. "The penalty does not matter. If my son is here, I am here. You can punish me, sir. You can fire me. You can do whatever it is you do to people who cross you. But I will not apologize for coming to get my child." Seung-Woo stared at her, the silence stretching taut. He saw the terror in her posture, the way she shielded the boy's head with her hand, yet he also saw a fire he hadn't encountered in years. She wasn't pleading for her life. She was demanding her right to protect her own. For the first time in a decade, the Iron Dragon felt a flicker of something other than contempt. He felt respect. The silence that followed Ethelyn's departure was heavier than the steel doors sealing the penthouse. Seung-Woo stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain blur the neon lights of Seoul below, but his mind was still back in the center of the room, fixated on the way the maid had looked at him. It wasn't just defiance. It was a specific kind of grief he recognized, a hardness born from surviving the impossible. He needed to know why a woman with that kind of fire was scrubbing floors in his building. An hour later, his chief of intelligence placed a tablet on the mahogany desk. The screen glowed with the details of Ethelyn's life, a digital trail of struggle and survival. Ethelyn Williams, age 26, a scholarship student who dropped out 2 years ago, no family in Korea, no connections, just a single mother living in the cramped staff quarters in the basement, hiding a child against building regulations. Seung-Woo swiped to the next page, his eyes scanning the data with cold indifference until he reached the section on her late husband. The file listed him as Park Min-jun, a generic name for a man who died in a hit-and-run accident 18 months ago. But when Seung-Woo tapped the image attached to the file, the air left his lungs as if he'd been punched. He wasn't looking at a stranger. The man in the photograph, smiling with an arm around a pregnant Ethelyn, was the only person in the world who shared Seung-Woo's blood. It was his half-brother, the secret son his father had cast aside to protect the family's legitimate image. Min-jun hadn't just been a casualty of a random accident. He was the undercover investigator who had infiltrated the syndicate 3 years ago, not to destroy it, but to pull Seung-Woo out of the darkness before it consumed him. Seung-Woo remembered the night Min-jun vanished. His inner circle had reported a rat was taken care of. They had told him the spy was an outsider, a threat to the dragon's throne. They had lied. Seung-Woo's hand trembled, the tablet clattering onto the desk. The realization hit him with the force of a bullet. The order to kill the spy had come from his own security team, the very men standing guard outside his door right now. They had murdered his brother to keep the syndicate rot alive. And Ethelyn, this woman scrubbing his floors, hiding in the shadows, was the widow of the only man who had ever tried to save him. He looked down at the photo of the toddler again. Merrick, the eyes he had found so captivating, the fearless curiosity. It wasn't a coincidence, it was blood. The boy wasn't just an intruder. He was the last remnant of the brother Seung-Woo had failed to protect. The Iron Dragon closed his eyes, and for the first time in 15 years, the cold calculation that fueled him shattered, replaced by a burning, terrifying need for redemption. He had let them kill the father. He would burn the world down before he let them touch the sun. The most feared man in Seoul sat on the floor of his penthouse, his tuxedo jacket discarded on a leather chair, his pristine white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the faint, jagged scars of a life lived by the blade. Scattered across the Italian marble, usually reserved for million-dollar contracts and silence, was a chaotic explosion of primary colors. Plastic building blocks. To any of his lieutenants, the sight would have been terrifying evidence of a mental break. To Shin Seung-Woo, it was the most critical negotiation of his career. Merrick sat opposite him, his small legs splayed in a V, drool glistening on his chin as he clutched a red block with intense, 2-year-old focus. He wasn't intimidated by the dragon's intense stare. In fact, he seemed to think the dragon was merely a large, well-dressed playmate. "Foundation, Merrick," Seung-Woo said, his voice low and serious, the same tone he used to order a syndicate takeover. He took a blue block and placed it firmly on the carpet. "You cannot build a kingdom on sand. You need a base that does not move when the wind blows." Merrick blinked, then smashed a yellow block onto the blue one, slightly off-center. He giggled, pleased with his architectural rebellion. Seung-Woo didn't smile. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently correcting the alignment. "Precision," he instructed. "If you are crooked, they will find a weakness. If you have a weakness, they will exploit it. And if they exploit it, everything falls." He stacked another block, then another. He was building a fortress, a rigid, impenetrable tower of plastic. It was a reflection of his own life, solitary, high, and defenseless against nothing because it allowed nothing inside. Merrick watched him, his little brow furrowed. Then, with a sudden squeal of delight, the toddler grabbed a handful of mismatched blocks, round ones, square ones, green and orange, and piled them haphazardly against Seung-Woo's perfect tower. Seung-Woo froze. His instinct was to clear the mess to restore order. But then he stopped. He looked at the structure. His single, perfect tower was strong, yes, but it was narrow. Merrick's chaotic addition had widened the base. It was messy, it was colorful, and it was undeniably stable. "You support the center," Seung-Woo murmured, a realization dawning on him that felt dangerously like wisdom. You don't just build up, you build out, you gather. Allies. Merrick looked at him, eyes shining, and handed Seung-Woo a small plastic figure, a little smiling man. He pointed to the top of the tower. Me? Seung-Woo asked. Merrick shook his head violently. No, he pointed at the figure, then tapped his own chest. Me. A laugh, rusty and unfamiliar, scraped its way out of Seung-Woo's throat. It was a sound that startled even him. He took the figure and placed it at the very top of the chaotic, sturdy structure they had built together. For 15 years, Seung-Woo had led by standing alone, a monolith of fear. But as he watched his brother's son clap his hands at their creation, the Iron Dragon realized he had been building his empire all wrong. A leader didn't stand alone at the top of a precipice. A leader built a foundation wide enough to hold the people he loved, even if it meant the structure wasn't perfect. Good, Seung-Woo whispered, the ghost of a smile touching his lips as he met the boy's gaze. You will be a better king than I ever was. The fortress that Shin Seung-Woo built was designed to withstand armies, but it had one fatal flaw. It relied on the loyalty of the men who guarded the walls. At 2:00 a.m., the lights didn't flicker. They died. The hum of the air filtration system cut out, plunging the penthouse into a suffocating, unnatural silence. The backup generators, rigged to engage within 3 seconds, remained dead. The Iron Dragon woke instantly, his hand finding the pistol under his pillow, but the silence told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a power failure. This was a purge. Down the hall, Ethelyn was already moving. The sudden darkness had woken Merrick, but before the toddler could cry, she pressed a hand to his chest, hushing him with a desperate urgency. She heard the sound of a keycard sliding into her electronic lock, a sound that shouldn't have been possible during a total system failure. The door hissed open. A beam of light cut through the room, blindingly bright. It didn't sweep the corners checking for threats, it locked instantly onto the crib. Ethelyn saw the silhouette behind the light, the broad, hulking shoulders of the chief of security. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He was dressed in black tactical gear, his face obscured by a balaclava, but she recognized the heavy, arrogant tread of his boots. He didn't pull a weapon. He reached for the boy. Give him to me, the voice rasped, distorted but familiar. He has something that doesn't belong to you. He wasn't looking at Merrick's face. He was looking at the tattered, brown teddy bear the boy refused to sleep without. The bear that Ethelyn's husband had given their son days before he died. The chief lunged. Ethelyn didn't think. She reacted with the ferocity of a cornered animal. She threw herself between the man and the crib, swinging a heavy brass lamp into his outstretched arm. Bone cracked. The man grunted, pain flaring into rage, and backhanded her across the room. She hit the wall hard, tasting blood, her vision swimming, but she saw his hand close around Merrick's arm. Merrick screamed, a high, piercing sound that shattered the stealth of the operation. The intruder froze. Heavy footsteps thundered down the corridor, rapid and lethal. The dragon was coming. The chief cursed, looking from the crying child to the open door. He realized he had seconds before Seung-Woo arrived. Snarling, he tried to rip the teddy bear from Merrick's grip, but the toddler held on with hysterical strength. The fabric tore, stuffing spilling out onto the mattress. The footsteps were at the door. The chief abandoned the prize, diving out the servant's access panel just as the room flooded with the beam of Seung-Woo's tactical light. Seung-Woo found them in the dark, Ethelyn bleeding on the floor, Merrick wailing in the crib, clutching the torn bear. The Iron Dragon didn't chase the shadow. He dropped his weapon and went to them, realizing with a cold, sickly dread that the enemy was no longer at the gates. The enemy was already inside the house. Ethelyn moved through the narrow service corridor, the ache in her ribs a sharp reminder of the night's violence. The penthouse was in total lockdown, transformed from a luxury estate into a fortress of steel and suspicion. She was supposed to be in the medical wing, but a mother's instinct refused to let her sit still while threats lurked in the dark. She needed to know the building was safe before she could close her eyes again. As she passed the ventilation grate behind the West Wing's command center, a hidden artery of the house used only by staff, a voice drifted through the metal slats. It was low, urgent, and terrifyingly familiar. It was the chief of security. He hadn't fled the estate. He was right there, in the heart of Seung-Woo's operations, supposedly coordinating the search for the intruder. But he wasn't barking orders to guards. He was speaking into a phone with the hushed, deadly calm of a conspirator. "The dragon is distracted," the chief whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the duct. "The woman and the brat made him weak. We don't need to wait for the shipment. We strike at the handover. 3:00 a.m., the shipyard." A pause, followed by a dark chuckle. "Yes, he dies tonight. Make it look like a rival hit. I want the territory, not a martyr." Ethelyn's blood ran cold. 3:00 a.m. That was less than 2 hours away. The handover was the peace summit Seung-Woo had prepared for all week, a meeting to end the turf wars. But it wasn't a peace treaty. It was an execution. She didn't scream. She didn't run, knowing the heavy thud of footsteps would give her away. She moved with the silent, practiced grace of a woman who had spent her entire life trying not to be seen. She navigated the maze of servant passages, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs, bursting out into the main foyer just as Seung-Woo was fastening his holster. He looked up, his face a mask of stone. He was dressed for war, flanked by 3 lieutenants, ready to leave for the shipyard. "You should be resting," Seung-Woo said, his voice clipped and distant. "Take the boy to the safe room. Do not open the door for anyone." "You can't go," Ethelyn gasped, ignoring the guards who tensed at her approach. She reached out, grabbing the sleeve of his tuxedo, a transgression that would have cost anyone else their hand. Seung-Woo looked at her hand on his arm, then up to her desperate eyes. "Ethelyn." "I heard him," she interrupted, her voice trembling but fierce. "Your chief. He isn't hunting the intruder, Seung-Woo. He is the intruder." The room went deathly silent. Seung-Woo signaled his men to lower their weapons. "What did you hear?" "The shipyard, 3:00 a.m., she recited, the words spilling out in a rush. "He said you've gone soft. He said the woman and the child made you weak. They aren't meeting you to sign a treaty, Seung-Woo. They're meeting to kill you and carve up the city." She tightened her grip on his sleeve. "It's a trap. The entire meeting is a trap." Seung-Woo stared at her. He looked at the darkening bruise on her cheek, the fierce protection in her stance. He processed the logic, the convenient blackout, the security lapse, the chief's aggression toward the child. It all fit. The glitches hadn't been errors, they were preparations. He slowly unbuckled his holster and placed it on the marble table. The air in the room shifted from the tension of a departure to the terrifying calm of a realization. He wasn't walking into a massacre anymore. Thanks to the maid in the shadows, he was about to orchestrate one. "Soft," he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at Ethelyn, and for the first time he didn't see a servant or a liability. He saw a partner. "They think I am soft because I let you in. They have no idea that you are the only reason I am still alive." The door to the private study slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the penthouse. But the silence that followed was short-lived. Inside, the iron dragon was burning. For 15 years. Shin Seung-Woo had prided himself on his icy control, his ability to suppress every human impulse in service of the syndicate. But the revelation that his chief of security, the man who had stood at his right hand, the man who had sworn loyalty on his own mother's grave, was the architect of his destruction, shattered that ice in an instant. A scream of raw, primal fury tore from his throat. He swept his arm across the sidebar, sending thousands of dollars of rare crystal decanters crashing to the floor. The smell of aged scotch filled the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood as a shard sliced his palm. He didn't feel it. He grabbed the heavy oak chair, a throne he had inherited from a father who taught him that love was weakness, and hurled it against the wall. It splintered, leaving a gouge in the expensive silk wallpaper. He was a fool, a blind, arrogant king sitting on a throne of lies. They had played him. They had manipulated him into isolating himself, into killing his own brother, all while they sharpened their knives in the dark. He punched the large portrait of the syndicate's founding fathers, his fist going through the canvas, cracking the frame. He hit it again, and again, until his knuckles were raw and the room looked like a war zone. He stood in the center of the wreckage, chest heaving, blood dripping from his hand onto the ruined Persian rug. He was a monster. That's what they wanted him to be, and that's what he had become. Papa. The small, trembling voice cut through the red haze of his rage. Seung-Woo froze. He spun around, his eyes wild, his body still coiled for violence. Standing in the doorway, clutching the doorframe with tiny fingers, was Merrick. The boy was wearing his pajamas, his eyes wide, taking in the destruction. Seung-Woo took a step back, shame washing over him cold and sharp. "Get out!" he rasped, his voice cracking. "Don't look at me." Merrick didn't leave. He looked at the broken glass. He looked at the overturned furniture. And then his gaze locked onto Seung-Woo's bleeding hand. The toddler's face crumpled, not in fear, but in sympathy. He walked across the room, navigating the debris with careful, unsteady steps. "No, Merrick, stay back," Seung-Woo warned, backing away until he hit his desk. He was dangerous. He was toxic. Merrick ignored the warning. He reached Seung-Woo and wrapped his small arms around the dragon's leg, pressing his face against the tailored trousers. He held on tight, an anchor in the storm. Then he reached up, his small, warm hand covering Seung-Woo's bloody fist. "Boo-boo," Merrick whispered, kissing the bruised knuckles. The fight went out of Seung-Woo all at once. His knees buckled, and he slid to the floor, surrounded by the ruins of his empire. He pulled the boy into his chest, burying his face in Merrick's soft hair, and for the first time since he was a child, the Iron Dragon wept. He wept for his brother, for the wasted years, and for the terrifying realization that this small boy had just saved him from the darkness one last time. The rain at the Incheon shipyard didn't wash away the grime. It only made the rust bleed darker down the sides of the shipping containers. Shin Seung-Woo stood in the center of the clearing, the floodlights cutting through the downpour to illuminate his solitary figure. He wore no armor, held no weapon, and his tuxedo was soaked through, clinging to him like a second skin. Surrounding him were 30 men, or what used to be his men, now standing behind the chief of security. "You look small without your walls, dragon," the chief sneered, stepping forward. He held a heavy pistol loosely at his side, the arrogance of a usurper who believes the crown is already his. "I told the board you were unstable, that the maid and the brat had turned your brain to mush. Tonight I prove it." Seung-Woo didn't flinch. "You killed my brother," he said, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "Park Min-jun. You ran him off the road 3 miles from here because he found the accounts you were skimming." The chief laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "He was a rat, and you're just a relic. The Castellano deal is done. The city belongs to the new management." He raised his gun, leveling it at Seung-Woo's chest. "Any last words, boss?" "Yes," a female voice rang out, sharp and trembling with adrenaline. "Look at what you killed him for." The chief's head snapped toward the black SUV parked in the shadows behind Seung-Woo. The door opened, and Ethelyn stepped out into the rain. She looked terrified, her hands shaking, but she walked until she stood beside the dragon. In her grip, she held the tattered, brown teddy bear that the chief had tried to steal from the nursery. "Get back in the car," Seung-Woo hissed, his composure cracking. "No," Ethelyn said. She looked directly at the chief, whose eyes widened as they locked onto the toy. "You tore apart our apartment looking for the ledger. You killed my husband because you thought he mailed it to the police. You broke into the penthouse to take this from my son." With a violent yank, Ethelyn ripped the seam of the bear's stomach. Stuffing drifted down into the mud, followed by a small, silver microchip encased in plastic. It clattered onto the wet asphalt, a tiny, insignificant thing that held the weight of an entire criminal empire. "Min-jun told me this bear would keep Merrick safe," she cried, rain mingling with the tears on her face. "I thought he meant it was a comfort. I didn't know it was your death sentence." The chief's face went pale. That chip didn't just contain proof of his embezzlement. It contained the encryption keys to the syndicate's offshore assets, the legacy key that legally bound the organization's wealth. Without it, he was just a thug in a wet parking lot. With it, he could buy nations. "Kill them," the chief screamed, abandoning all pretense of honor. "Kill them both and get that chip." But the 30 men hesitated. They looked at the chip, then at the dragon, who was now shielding the maid with his own body. They realized in that split second that the power had never been in the guns. It had been in the secrets. And the secrets were now in the hands of the woman the chief had made a widow. The standoff had shifted. The dragon wasn't cornered, he was just waiting for the lightning to strike. The scream tore through the rain, raw and desperate. Realizing his authority was dissolving with the mud under his boots, the chief of security didn't wait for his men to regain their nerve. He leveled his weapon at Ethelyn, his finger tightening on the trigger with the intent to erase the witness, the widow, and the truth in one motion. But the iron dragon was faster. Seung-Woo didn't just move. He struck with the precision of a man who had spent 15 years anticipating betrayal. He deflected the barrel a fraction of a second before the muzzle flashed, the bullet tearing harmlessly into the shipping container behind them. With a sickening crunch, Seung-Woo's elbow connected with the chief's jaw, sending the traitor crashing into the waterlogged asphalt. Before the chief could scramble up, Seung-Woo had the gun, his own gun, stolen during the coup, pressed against the man's forehead. Thunder rattled the shipyard, but the silence in the clearing was absolute. 30 men watched, their breaths held in their chests. They knew the code. They knew the penalty for treason. They waited for the pink mist, for the execution that would cement Seung-Woo's return to power. Seung-Woo stared down at the man who had murdered his brother. The rage that had destroyed his office hours ago was still there, a living thing in his chest, demanding blood for blood. His fingers squeezed the trigger, taking up the slack. It would be so easy. One pull, and the ghost of Park Min-jun would be avenged. The cycle would continue, perfect and unbroken. Then he saw Ethelyn. She hadn't run. She stood frozen in the rain, clutching the torn teddy bare to her chest, her eyes locked on him. In her gaze, he didn't see the fear of a victim. He saw the judgment of a mother. And in the periphery of his mind, he felt the phantom weight of a small, warm hand covering his bruised knuckles. Boo-boo. If he pulled the trigger now, he would go home to Merrick with death on his hands. He would hug the boy, and the boy would smell the gunpowder and the copper tang of a life stolen. He would be the monster Merrick believed was just a nightmare. Seung-Woo's hand trembled. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick. "Do it," the chief spat, blood bubbling on his lips. "Be the dragon." "No," Seung-Woo whispered. He released the tension on the trigger and pistol-whipped the chief across the temple, knocking him unconscious into the mud. He stood up, the rain soaking his face, washing away the sweat and the fury. He turned to the 30 men, who looked at him with confusion bordering on terror. "The dragon is dead," Seung-Woo announced, his voice carrying over the storm. He reached down and picked up the silver chip from the puddle, the legacy key. "And so is this syndicate. This chip doesn't just hold the money. It holds the evidence of every crime, every bribe, and every murder committed by this man." He tossed the gun into the dark water of the bay. "The police are already on their way. If you stay, you go to prison. If you leave, you live. Choose." He didn't wait to see who stayed. He walked to Ethelyn, took the trembling woman into his arms, and led her away from the darkness, leaving the gun and the old life to rust in the rain. The rain that once drowned the Incheon shipyard felt like a distant memory, replaced by the warm, golden light of a crisp autumn morning in Seoul. The headlines that day didn't scream of gang wars or bodies found in the harbor. Instead, they announced the launch of the Min-jun Initiative, a global foundation dedicated to protecting vulnerable families, named after the brother Shin Seung-Woo had finally laid to rest with honor. Inside the private chambers of the Supreme Court, the air was still, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of the penthouse. It was the hush of a new beginning. Seung-Woo sat at a heavy oak table, not gripping a gun but a fountain pen, the same pen Merrick had played with on the night everything changed. He looked down at the documents in front of him. For 15 years, his signature had authorized fear. Today, it authorized a promise. Beside him sat Ethelyn. She was no longer the maid hiding in the shadows of the servants' quarters. Dressed in white, her hand resting firmly on Seung-Woo's arm, she radiated a quiet strength that had tamed a dragon. When the judge pushed the final decree forward, Seung-Woo didn't hesitate. He signed his name with a steady hand, officially erasing Merrick Williams and writing Shin Merrick into existence. "It is done," the judge said, smiling. Merrick, now 3 years old and wearing a tiny tuxedo that matched his father's, didn't understand the legal weight of the moment. He only knew that the man who built towers with him was smiling. He scrambled onto Seung-Woo's lap, burying his face in the crook of his neck. "Papa," he whispered, a word that held more power than any title in the underworld. Seung-Woo held his son tight, looking over the boy's head to Ethelyn. He took her hand, the gold band on her finger catching the light, a symbol of the vows they had exchanged in a quiet ceremony just hours before. The Iron Dragon was dead, buried in the mud of the shipyard. In his place stood a husband and a father, a man who had dismantled an empire of blood to build a legacy of love. He had lost the city's fear, but he had gained something far more dangerous to his enemies. He had something to live for. True power is not found in the ability to take a life, but in the courage to change your own for the sake of those who trust you without question. What would you do if you found out your life's work was built on a lie, but a child's love gave you the truth? Tell me in the comments below.